Graduated from the School of Hard Knocks at 15. He witnessed a friend shot to death by hitmen from the Colombo crime family. At 17, he was involved in a gang fight and shot in the forehead by a .22 caliber gun. It was after this life-threatening moment that Carlo decided to turn his life around. Then, after 9 years as a successful real estate agent, he walked away with the goal of becoming a professional writer. His research into child abuse piqued his interest in abused children that grew into the abusers, the sociopaths. After corresponding with serial killers in prisons and visiting death rows, Carlo made a connection with Richard Ramirez, California's Night Stalker. While visiting with Ramirez at San Quentin's death row, Carlo decided to write an account of the case. The Night Stalker quickly became a bestseller, launching Carlo's career as an author. He's our special guest tonight on Coast to Coast. Philip, thanks for being on the program. Appreciate it.
George, it is so my pleasure. It is so great to be back with you, actually.
Yeah, it has been a while for us. You know, Philip, the story that I used to lead into you that occurred in East St. Louis, Illinois, where a woman kills another woman, cuts out her fetus, and then, though she has not been charged, may ultimately be implicated in the deaths of 3 little kids and dumping them in the washer and dryer, for crying out loud.
Right.
What's going on with people, Philip?
Well, George, I mean, I think in this particular case, there's no ongoing pathology as such. In other words, it's just this one incident. I think basically what we're talking about is a woman that just went nuts. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that it was a crack-induced or some kind of drug-induced psychosis. And like I say, the real telling of the degree of her insanity, her evil, is whether or not this was just one incident. And apparently it was just that one incident. Although it's pretty extreme, George, doing what you just described is no easy task. It's not like you see on television where the knife just goes in and the cut is that easy. It's very difficult to do what you just described. And the killing of 3 children, she had to be possessed in some way with some form of insanity. Although, unfortunately, we're hearing of these types of incidences, i.e., women who just lose it and kill children, kill their children. We have, of course, the case where the woman drowned her 5 children,
right,
and was recently diagnosed as being not fit to stand trial. So I think it's more a matter of mental illness than almost a criminality, as if you would, George. Unlike, for instance, a serial killer, where they cunningly stalk and plan heinous crimes over a period of time, sometimes as many as 30, 40 years. Most recently, we have a good example of that type of pathology in the BTK killer, who is an individual that for nearly 40 years was stalking, planning, and killing, torturing and killing human beings. Dennis Radar, his name was.
And he fit right into his neighborhood. Nobody would have known.
Everyone was so shocked, George, and that's the way it always is with these guys. That's one of the reasons why I found them so interesting, and it's something that drew me to it, because it's a matter of really understanding that you can't just look at these guys and know that what they're capable of. They hide who they really are extremely well. As you just made the point, this guy was the pillar of the community, deacon of his church, the head of the church, had a nice job, was loved by his neighbors, family. Supposedly his wife had no idea about what he was really into. But he was actually, with regard to children, he was hanging children by wire by their necks.
Oh, my God.
And I know, George, some of the things we're going to talk about are very unpleasant, but one of the reasons why I love being with you is that I can tell the truth about what the truth is. And in this case, the truth was we're dealing with a severe sexual sadist who was actually getting sexually aroused by these heinous acts, and they were also perpetrated against children. And he would then go on to relive it, as we know, in law enforcement the acts, i.e., writing letters about them, drawings of them, and reliving them, and masturbating as he thought about them. I mean, the degree of the sickness goes to that far, and what's so scary about those types of people is that how well they plan what they're going to do, and they don't get caught. I mean,
for their acts, they are almost genius at what they do, sadly enough.
Exactly. I mean, in a sense, George, they are genius. He got himself caught by keeping to. He couldn't leave well enough alone. His taunting of the cops, which is another aspect of his. I hope he's listening now.
His letters did him in, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, he stupidly sent a DVD that had his name on it, and he didn't realize it. It connected to the church, and his name was on it, and they got him immediately. But the cops had no idea it was him. They were absolutely clueless. And in fact, when he was uncovered for being the monster everyone was looking for, everyone was so shocked. I mean, looked like Mr. Magoo. You'd never in a million years think he was even remotely capable of such thoughts, let alone such acts.
His ego did him in
a sense, but it's even more complicated and deeper than that, George, because that taunting of the police made him feel that he was really omnipotent and he was godlike and he could never be caught, and that was part and parcel of his pathology. It's quite possible, George, he's listening right now because they have access to AM radio, and they often stay up all night long in jail. They reverse everything. They sleep during the day, and they stay up at night.
Well, and Philip, I get letters from inmates,
right.
And we have a huge audience. Boy, if they ever got rating books, we'd have a 90 share in some of these prisons.
Well, if he is listening, I'd like to tell him I wish he'd go out in general population, because the population will treat him like the low-life scumbag that he is, and they make sure justice is served. It's interesting, George, because jails are jungles. Jails are the place where we keep the animals that are out of control. We literally have to keep them in cages, and they are. But even in jail... But
they're not all animals, though, Philip. Some of them have done stupid things in their life that I'm sure they regret. Right?
I'm talking about the out-of-control, violent individuals.
Yeah, okay. All right, I'm with you.
And even in that place, guys like Dennis Rader are not tolerated. Guys like Dennis Rader are not put up with. Guys like Dennis Rader are beaten to death. Guys like Dennis Rader are child killers, rapers of women, are not looked on kindly, and they're beaten to death. You know, we did a show a while back about predator priests in the Catholic Church.
Right.
And there was, a year and a half ago, not to get off the subject, but there was this pedophile priest named John Gagan.
Out of Boston, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he wasn't in jail a year, and a prisoner got in a cell, bound him with socks, stuffed a sock in his mouth, tied him, and proceeded to quite literally beat him to death. And that's my point. I mean, the criminals will not tolerate these scumbags, and they make sure justice is served. You know, in the Bible it says those that would abuse a child will have a rock tied to the neck and thrown in the river. And even there, it's being laid down that at some point you've got to draw the line and just make sure that justice is served quickly and for sure. Unfortunately, George, all too often these types of people fall through the cracks, fall through the system, as in the case of Dennis Rader, how for so many years he was successful, as in the case of the BTK killer, the Green River killer,
right?
Who also for 30 years they couldn't catch him. He was leaving bodies all over the place. The point at which he had 52 victims.
Didn't Ted Bundy help find that guy?
Exactly. Well, he called him the Riverman, and he first made the cops cognizant of the fact that it's not that there are clusters. that if they look more carefully wherever they found any given body, they'll find more bodies because he's leaving them in clusters. And they did do that, and they did find more bodies, and Bundy was right on the money. Bundy also, George, is a very good example of the clever pathology of these individuals, how they plan meticulously not to get caught. And that's what makes them so dangerous, and that's why it's so important for people like you, George, to give access to the media, but people like me who study these individuals, who are trying to show what they're really like, who are trying to basically shine light in this dark, dark place. It's not, and George, it's so interesting because it's not really just about the bodies. It's not just about their crimes. It really should be about, and this is what we'll talk about, how they get that way, how a Ted Bundy is made. What makes Dennis Rader? Are they made? Are they born that way? These are the questions that we have to address, and if I may, I'll talk to them.
Absolutely, and as we evolve into this discussion tonight, Philip, hitmen. I mean, I want to talk with you about that because are they different from a serial killer? Because do they show emotion? How many people do they bump off? And, I mean, how could someone do that and not feel any feeling? And maybe they do feel feeling. You'll tell us about that. But let me ask you this, Philip.
Please.
Is there something going on in this country right now that is creating this apparent surge in violence? Or has this been going on since the beginning of time?
Well, it's a combination. It's a fusion of several factors, George, one of which is, of course, it's been going on since the beginning of time. Crime, heinous crime, terrible crime. Comparatively speaking, what's going on in modern times pales to what happened in the medieval eras, the Spanish Inquisition. The whole concept of werewolves was basically serial killers. Your listeners need to understand this. The contrivance of werewolves was really men who were serial killers and killing victims and tearing their throats out and ripping their bodies apart and leaving them so mangled and torn up that it appeared as though an animal had done that, certainly not a human being. And nobody's mind could wrap around what they were seeing. So they made up this folklore, this myth that it was half man, half wolf that did that. They couldn't accept the responsibility of a human being being capable of something like that. I think to some degree that's also what happened with vampires, i.e. people who were obsessed with the drinking of blood and would go out and do that. And it could be the local shoemaker. It could be the local jeweler who once a month or every 2 months had a penchant to do that. And when they found the body and the throat was torn open and clearly blood had been drawn out, they had to conjure up some kind of monster that did that. Certainly a human being couldn't do that.
As I've always said, Philip, that reality is scarier than fiction. I would prefer to think that there were werewolves out there or vampires. To think that actual human beings are doing these things, that's scarier.
It actually, you're right, and unfortunately, it's all throughout history. So there really is an ongoing pathology. It's not really just a phenomenon that's a byproduct of modern times. But to answer your question, George, there are now the last 5-6 years there has been an upsurge in felony crimes, in violent crimes, in rapes. And I think there are some reasons that contribute to what's going on, and basically it has to do with the lack of funding for boots on the street for cops. Under the Clinton administration, for whatever anyone wants to say about his administration, he made a lot of money available for extra police in every state in the country. And all those extra feet on the street, as they say, help drive down crime. The crack epidemic came to an end. That helped drive down the statistics. What's helping to drive up the statistic is the funds, the federal money that was available for extra police. that's been taken away.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we have a lot of people are talking about the immigration problem. I should say the illegal immigration problem, but they don't really quite know what's going on, and I do. Out of every 1,000 illegal immigrants that come over, we get 100, 150, 10 to 15% that are a criminal element, that in their own countries they were committing crimes. And they come here, and because we're such an open, free society, they have free access, free reign to us, at us, and they commit violent crimes. These are the types of individuals that, when they're sober, but they seem okay, but they look around, they see wealth, they see people driving nice cars. They don't understand that the people that they see with the money driving nice cars, they worked hard.
Mm-hmm.
It was a matter of blood and sweat.
Well, most of them worked hard. Some of them probably pillaged other people to get to where they are.
Well, yeah, but for the most part, we're all about working hard and being successful. Your success is generally a byproduct of hard work. Yes, of course, we'll talk about the mafia in great detail tonight. They don't do that, but I guess to some degree they work hard too. They put their lives on the line. The point is they start feeling jealous, they start feeling envy, and that soon turns to something else, a hatred. They have a drink, a couple of drinks, and the next thing you know, they think they have free reign to do whatever they want, and they do.
But see, that's also, though, my point, Philip. I believe that there is more hatred going on today than there was years ago.
On a sociological point of view, absolutely. Part of that has to do with being there's an infusion of an element that we didn't have before, George, and it's these illegal immigrants. The numbers are staggering. The amount of them that are coming over the border are staggering. It's not just Mexicans. It's Central America. It's all of South America, and there's millions every year, and they are becoming part and parcel of our society. There is no check and balance. There's no one at the border stopping them. Number one. Number two, when they get here, they could do whatever they want, even if they're caught. An illegal immigrant's caught, they're not even sent back. They're not even frightened of that anymore. And I'm certainly, and I know there's some people listening to this out there, and they're getting angry at me because I'm blaming it on them. I'm not blaming it on them. I'm blaming it on the people who are coming here illegally and doing criminal acts. It's the large numbers of them that is alarming, that I'm concerned with, that is not being addressed by law enforcement either on the federal, state, or city level.
All right, stay with us, Philip. More in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest tonight, Philip Carlo, his website, philipcarlo.com. It's linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Take a look at some of his work, his investigative work. We'll be back with him as we talk more about the mind of a killer on Coast to Coast AM. Philip, all the work you've done, of course, you did this one with Richard Ramirez, California's Night Stalker. That had to have been a bizarre connection for you.
Well, I mean, bizarre is not quite the word, George. For your listeners' benefit, Richard Ramirez was a serial killer who terrorized Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. He was dubbed the Night Stalker by the press. And that monkey was a very, very appropriate because he came out at night and he stalked the night. He wore all black, very cunning, very motivated, very driven. And basically, he was convicted of entering homes, 19 different incidences in the middle of the night, raping and killing women and their husbands. And it went on for 14 months. Every cop in Los Angeles was looking for this guy. They couldn't capture him. And ultimately, he was brought down in August of 85, convicted in 1989. I met him in '92 in San Quentin's death row. I first communicated with him via mail. He agreed to meet with me. I met with him, and he was he was surprised. I was surprised at how grounded he was, for want of a better way to put it. Not a monster, congenial, polite, funny. I would venture to say a gentleman. That's the person I met. I didn't meet the person on the street. I think when these guys get arrested, they become institutionalized. They mellow out as such. But you mentioned Ted Bundy before. It's the same type of thing. These individuals have a duality about them. On the one hand, they can be the nicest guy in the world, somebody you'd want as a neighbor, maybe somebody you'd want as a friend, actually somebody you would want as a friend. But they have this other hidden dark side that they manage to mask so well from people that know them, people that are close to them, and society at large. And that's what makes them so dangerous. That's what makes them so scary.
Unpredictable. Could these be demons in these people, Philip? I mean, actual, true demons, the demons that we've known about for years, the demons from hell that somehow have possessed these people and at any given time can literally take them over?
Well, if anyone was ever possessed, it was Richard Ramirez. He was a Satanist, an avowed Satanist. He drew pentagrams on victims' bodies on the wall in blood. During his trial, there were some outbursts where he stood up and yelled out, "Hail Satan." He had a pentagram drawn in his hand, which he showed the media, which scared the hell out of people because he wasn't faking it. He wasn't acting that way. But, George, I've done a lot of research into this. In that incident down in Matamoros, Mexico, where they found all those bodies on the Santa Elena Ranch, Adolfo Constanzo sacrificed 13 people. I traveled to Brazil. I traveled to Haiti. I interviewed people who were involved in human sacrifice, who were committing human sacrifice. And I know of what I talk. And what I think this is all about is you can't blame it on some evil entity. You can't blame it on, generally speaking, on people being possessed. Even in the case of Richard Ramirez, I think that's all just a guise. I think it's a contrivance. I think the Satan is a man-made contrivance to blame everyone but the people who are responsible for the actual crimes. That's not to say that there aren't evil spirits, quote unquote. That's not to say that there aren't ghosts, but I think 99% of the heinous crimes that we're witnessing are just people who were either born with an inclination that way or were severely abused as children, or any combination of the two that makes them. I've interviewed over 15 incarcerated serial killers, George, and not one of them was possessed. What they all were was extreme sexual sadists. What motivated them, what drove them, was killing people. That was their sunset, their sunrise. That is air, that is food, that is sustenance. As hard as this might be to hear, it's the truth. It's the hardcore truth. Your listeners need to know that. Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Richard Ramirez, Jack the Ripper. They all came from the same mold, and that mold is basically, the long and the short of it, is sexual sadism. All of them had sex with their victims. All of them ejaculated. But again, George, to answer your question, in my opinion, it's just broken machines. It's human beings that have gone the wrong way. You mentioned before my latest book, The Iceman. This guy's name was Richard Kuklinski. HBO did 3 60-minute documentaries on him because what he was saying and what he was about was so unusual and so different. He talked about murder. He murdered, George, over 200 people. But he talked about murder with a cold candidness that we've never quite heard before. and an evil sincerity, if you would, that we never heard before.
Did he get paid for this, Philip? Obviously.
Oh, well, you know, if I may, George, my point was he was severely abused as a child, and that this is not to offer up an excuse for bad behavior, but with most of them, I've discovered via my sitting down and talking with them, via looking at the statistics, most of these guys on death row, most of these guys capable of severe brutality without any guilt, any remorse, no conscience, were severely abused in the formative years, in the building block years, 2 to 8, 3 to 9, those times when we need nurturing and love and tactile touch, pleasant touch. They're being whipped and brutalized and sodomized, and they grow up very angry, George. And that anger, they turn on their fellow man. They look left and they look right, and they don't see neighbors. They see victims, potential victims. They become carnivores. They become jungle predators. And I think essentially, and it might sound like an oversimplification, but it really is this simple. They're almost made. It's beaten into them. In the case of Kuklinski, when he was just 5 years old, he saw his father beat to death his older brother, who was 7. The father was brutalized his 2 sons, Richard and Florian, ultimately beat Florian to death. It was a poor family. It was in Jersey City. He was put in a cheap pine coffin, and Richard would stand by the coffin in the 2 days during the morning and beg for his brother to wake up, but he never woke up. He didn't understand what death was. He thought he was sleeping. This he's telling me as a 67-year-old man. And then ultimately the father let him alone for a while, but soon he went back to his old ways and beat the boy and whipped the boy and hit the boy and knocked him out. And basically he beat into Richard what he became. He beat sympathy. He beat empathy out of him.
Yes.
By the time he was 10 years old, he was filled with hatred.
And who beat it out of the father? Somebody else must have done that to him.
Well, exactly right, George, because it is always about a cycle. And it's talking like we are now that ultimately can break the cycle, because there are ways to remedy it. And needless to say, we've changed a lot since Kuklinski was a child. He was born in 1935. This murder occurred in 1940. There was no real setup for child abuse back then. There is now. The school systems are much more aware of how to recognize severely abused children, how to get them out of homes. Unfortunately, the system still fails miserably, but it's gotten much better than it was back then.
Well, let me ask you this, Philip, with regards to serial killers.
Yes.
This is going to be a kind of a twofold question. Question
Please.
one, of course, is if you have 10 serial killers, how many do you believe were abused as children?
10. Without question.
Okay. All right. Now, the next question is if you had 10 abused children, how many will turn out to be serial killers?
That's a really, really good question. And there are factors that come into play that mitigate what they become, i.e., at some point they get love. At some point they got a therapy. At some point they manage to grab themselves by their bootstraps and go in another direction. And that doesn't, and they should be proud of it. They should be glad, and they should be honored for it. But that doesn't take away the fact that let's say 2 children in the same household. Let's say Richard's brother didn't get killed, and he grew up, and he went on to become a successful businessman. Well, praise be to him. But the fact that Richard wasn't able to, for whatever reason or reasons, to get past what had done to him, in a sense you can't blame him, because it happened to him at an age when he couldn't file correctly what was being done to him. That's the tragedy of child abuse. The fact that it happens when the child cannot classify, cannot file it in such a way that they learn how to deal with it, and they ultimately become overwhelmed with it, and they end up becoming caught up in antisocial behavior, sociopaths, which metamorphosizes into psychopaths. And once they get to that level, they're a danger. Who are they a danger to? They're a danger to us. So to answer your question, it's mitigating circumstances that come into play that direct the severely abused child on a path away from destruction. It might be at some point they were taken over by their grandparents, or a child was taken out of the home of the abuser and the grandparents or a loving aunt, or the church might have been seated in a good way. But the point is they were taken off that merry-go-round. That's what I think the bottom line is.
But he may have loved, someone may have loved the grandparents, but they may have still been serial killers. They may have killed other people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And how many serial killers, mass murderers, do you think are walking around the United States right now? They're not caught. We don't know who they are, but they're all over the place. How many of them?
Well,
on any active basis?
You know, I've heard a lot of different numbers. According to the FBI's behavioral science unit, at any given time, there's on the average 500 of them.
500 of them?
Yeah.
And how many people on the average then do you think they may have killed, each one?
Well,
5, 10 people, what?
It's hard to say because the fever, the homicidal fever that these people become inflicted with varies. As an example, in Ramirez's case, there were incidences where he was convicted of 2 and 3 attacks a night. Then in the case of a John Wayne Gacy, for your listeners' benefit, John Wayne Gacy was the killer clown. He was a homosexual serial killer whose penchant was for teenage boys. The point at which he was arrested, he had 48 bodies buried in the basement of his home. And he did that over a 20-year period. So it varies with each one of them. But, and then they change. They might, like the BTK killer, he had basically 8 victims over a 40-year period. Now, those are the only victims we know about. I never take their word for the amount of victims they really had. I think they lied through their teeth. Can't trust them. I know for a fact that Ted Bundy had a lot more victims than he was suspected of. I know for a fact that Richard Ramirez had a lot more victims than he was convicted of. And it goes on and on and on. We see, George, part of the problem is this. What these guys are learning is how not to get caught. It is the biggest lie that they subconsciously leave clues that they really want to get caught.
Right, yeah.
That is a misnomer. That is so not true. The only regret they ever have when they do get caught is that they were caught. They love what they're doing. Their world evolves around doing that. When they're not doing it, they think about doing it. They plan it.
They plan it how far in advance?
Way in advance. If I may give an excellent example of the degree to which they planned it. Ted Bundy actually went and had a cast made for his arm that he could slip on and slip off for his left arm. And he would walk. He had a Volkswagen Bug. He took the passenger seat out of the Volkswagen Bug, parked it on or near a campus, and he'd walk on the block where his car was. He purposely picked a quiet block, a block that was particularly dark, and in the cast he had a tire iron. And he'd be walking with 10, 15 books, and when he saw a likely suspect, a woman that fit his victim group, he dropped the books at the appropriate time, and many women said, "Gee, can I help you?"
They felt sorry for him. They look at the cast.
Sure, please do. And, yeah, my car's right here. That's so nice of you. And he would start talking to them. And that moment, he plotted it. He planned it. He rehearsed it. His facial details, the smile on his face, the set of his body, all spoke of a man that was harmless. Sure you can trust me. No problem. Thank you so much for helping me. When really what we're looking at here is a true wolf in sheep's clothing. Yeah, gets over to the car, opens the passenger side. Would you be kind enough to put the books in the car? Gee, thank you so much. This is so sweet of you, so nice of you. People aren't like that anymore. They don't really stop to help. And the moment that they bent over to put in the car,
Bang.
He'd whip out that tire iron, crack them in the head, knock them out, get them in the car, bind them quickly, and then drive off and took them to an area he had planned, he had staked out, he had weapons there, he had rope there, he had methods to torture them there. He bound them, and he did his thing. And that's the degree to which they plan it. It is very rarely haphazard. Also, I've got to hark back to the BTK killer. Look how well he planned what he did. He dressed himself up in the uniform that he wore, i.e., he was a city inspector, and in that guise, he was able to drive around the neighborhood, go into people's homes, and what he was doing was really looking for likely victims. And I have to also use the example, we're talking now about predators, sexual predators in general, not just serial killers, although the two examples I just used were of serial killers. But, George, as we've discussed before, pedophiles dressing up as priests and
True.
entering the church. These are guys who are highly motivated.
Because, and I believe, like you do, Philip, they were pedophiles before they were priests.
Oh, absolutely. These are people that were obsessed pedophiles that joined the church because they knew they'd be protected, have a roof over their head, and free access to children, and that the church would ultimately always protect them, always opt on the side of their reputation and never opt on the side of the children, and that's why they joined the church en masse. If you see all the men who are arrested for child molestation in the church, they're all elderly individuals in their 70s, and that tells us that they were in the seminars in the late 50s and the 60s. But
Stay with us, Phil. Got to take this break. We'll be right back. Up next, Philip Carlo on Coast to Coast AM. Interesting fast blast, Philip, that I have this message from Gerald in Tacoma, Washington. He says, my wife was almost the victim of Ted Bundy in about 67 to 68 at a university in Tacoma. She fit his victim profile. She was late for class when he approached her on crutches and fell down near her. So there's that MO. She was late for class, so she ignored him, and she's still alive. That saved her life, the fact that she kept going.
Well, and it proves exactly what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, about how motivated, how driven, how cunning they are. And I want to tell you something, George. This is not isolated. I'm using him as an example, a good example of the degree to which they go to get their victim. And unfortunately, all too often what's happening now is they're doing these types of things and they're getting away with it. Or talking about it just the way the woman listening out there right now, we're educating them. We're telling them what they need to know. We're telling them that in today's society, you cannot trust people unless you know who they are. You don't take what you see for face value. You know, it's interesting. I asked Ramirez, the Night Stalker, how, towards the end of my interview with him, I asked him Richard, you're being an expert in this. How could you give me advice on something I can put in my book about how women can protect themselves from people like you? That was the question I asked, and you want to know what his answer was?
I'd love to know what his answer was.
His answer was, you can't. His answer was this: if somebody like me gets you in their sights, we hone in on you like a hungry lion does to prey, and we're going to go for you. And
so, are you saying it's all over for you the minute one of these sickos?
No, because I didn't leave it at that. I said, well, let's say you were talking to your sister. He was very close to his sister. What would you tell her? How could she better protect herself, Richard? And then he said this. He said, by being aware by looking left and looking right and knowing who's behind you, not walking around the world like you have blinders on, seeing the truth, seeing what's going on, taking your eyes from the ground and lifting them up and being aware of your environment. And if you see somebody suspicious, don't be afraid to react. He said, if you're walking into your door, if you walk into your home, you go into the door and you see somebody 10 feet behind you and you get a bad feeling, go with that feeling. Don't go to the door. Walk back to the street. Go to the center of the street and start walking towards an avenue. And that's, and it's like that. It's that gut feeling. It's that gut reaction that we have to learn to trust again. And women, and I'm saying women because for the most part, their victims are female, although there are male victims also, but the majority of serial killers go after females.
Sure, but Dahmer went after male victims,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And John Wayne Gacy. And also Gacy had a whole act. You know, he'd be the nice guy, friendly guy, come on back to my place, have a beer, I got to, smoke a joint. And what he did, he slipped them a Mickey. He put a drug in their drink, he'd get them unconscious. And in furtherance of what we were talking about before in terms of preparation, he had a rack all set up, the old-fashioned rack where you put the head and the hands were put through
and lock you in there.
Well, he had one of those in his bedroom that he was into construction. He built it, and he'd get them in that position. And once they were in that position, he proceeded to mutilate them from behind. I don't want to go into any more detail.
No,
Suffice it to say, the degree of the sadism is mind-boggling. Yet, an hour or 2 or 3 hours prior to him gleefully doing such a heinous, terrible, disgusting thing, he had this big smile on his face. He had pictures of himself as a clown on the wall. Oh, yeah, look, I'm a clown. That was such and such a day. And here I am with Rosalynn Carter. I'm an assemblyman, and I do this and I do that. And, you think, yeah, gee, what a hell of a nice, jovial guy. When what he really was a monster.
Could he be a friend to someone, let's say a dear friend, where, and again, you'd realize what was going on, but let's assume you didn't, and then at the same time, capture other people?
I tell you, George, you're a funny guy, man. Me? No, not me. I'm a cynical. I've been around the block, George. I'm from Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. I know.
You'd catch them all.
I've got the eye, man. I know. But yes, until you're made cognizant, until you're made aware, until you listen to somebody like me, you really don't know. And why should you know? Why should the average Joe or Jane pay attention to what we're talking about? I'll tell you why. Because it's those people that become the victims. In many cases, in the Night Stalker instance, I shouldn't say many, in the 19 attacks, in 4 of the homes he entered, he walked right in the front door. Why? The people that lived in those homes, all of them said, I don't want to feel like I live in a cage. I don't want to feel that I can't trust people, the world I live in. I don't want to live like that. And them believing that and saying that and thinking that way is exactly why they became victims. Had their front door been locked, had they taken that extra precaution, perhaps the monster that the Night Stalker was would not have been able to walk into their homes with breathing fire and a knife in his hand and a gun in his hand, a knife in one hand and his you-know-what in the other hand.
God. Well, let's use Bundy as an example.
Please.
Before he went into this other mode, this other character of a serial killer, he was a generally pleasant person. People really didn't know, the average person. But what would happen to him, Philip, if you were looking in the eyes of the Ted Bundy, the serial killer? What would you see at that point?
You see a monster. That's such a good question, George. And there is a physical manifestation of literally of the other side. Let's call it the dark side, for want of a better way to put it. And their features change. It's almost they look like two different people. And listen to this, George. They smell differently.
What do you mean they smell differently?
How
can that be?
I've heard this time and time again about how serial killers have a very specific odor. It's not BO. It's something else. It's like a glandular thing. An odor comes from them.
Huh.
And in the case of the Night Stalker, everyone described this odd, this strange smell that came from him. Also, in the case of Arthur Shawcross in Rochester, New York, and also in the case of Bundy, this odd, peculiar smell. And I was so curious to see if Ramirez had actually issued from Ramirez. And when I met him, I would meet him in the morning, and he had showered already. Sometimes he'd come down and his hair was still wet. And sometimes when the wind came from behind him, I could smell it. And it was like this wet leather smell he had. And I don't quite know. I asked a couple of doctors about this. A friend of mine, Dr. Richard Ash, told me that he thinks they had a glandular imbalance, and then because of that, they gave off this odd odor. We were talking before, if I may, about Richard Kuklinski and how he was a contract killer, and how being a contract killer is so different than being a serial killer. But still, he had to have that ability to walk up to a potential victim with a face like he was a friend. You look at this guy, and you think there's no problem here. And if I may, what I'm saying is, these guys, these quote-unquote professional killers, Kuklinski was a contract killer. Ted Bundy was what we call a bloodlust killer. But Bundy was so motivated and so obsessed with what he was doing, he became, quote-unquote, a professional killer. He became so adept at what he was doing that he rose in that world to the apex of what he was doing. You could say he was a professional. He was so good at it. Yes, he wasn't getting paid monetarily, but he was getting paid in what he was after. He was getting paid in what he wanted the most, and that was free access to a woman he could terrorize and destroy.
And I think he enjoyed the game of the cast or the crutch. I mean, he was play acting all this.
He was stalking. He was stalking. He was enjoying it to the extent that he was entering the space of the victim. He was spotting the victim, and in order
controlling the victim.
Exactly, that's the word, controlling. And in order to not scare the victim away, just the way a lion might chase away a gazelle, he put on a guise of something that could be trusted. That's like a lion, a hungry lion, dressing up like another gazelle and saying, "Hey, no problem here, no threat here," you know. And it's believable. It's so believable that you drop your guard. I know, if I may, in the case of Kuklinski, there was a victim that had to be tortured that was specifically requested. And Richard followed this guy for 3 days. He saw that he left his house every day at 10 o'clock. He saw that he drove down a specific road, took a right at a stop sign. Well, he parked his car at that stop sign. He opened his hood, and 5 after 10, he was there with his blinker lights on. And the guy came down the road. You know, it was the morning, just thinking about his thoughts of the day. They make eye contact. Richard walks around the guy, flags him down. You know, "Hey, buddy, can you help me?" "Yeah, you know, what do you want? What's up?" Rolling down the window, and the next instant, the guy's got a gun to his head. Richard gets him out of the car, puts him in his car, and he's got him. My point is this: there was 2-3 seconds where they made eye contact and where the victim looked, and he thought to himself, "No problem here." In other words, he didn't step on the gas and take off. He felt for that, "Hey, buddy, can you give me a hand?" And it's the same thing that Ted Bundy did. "Hey, ma'am, can you help me here? Can you give me a hand?" So I guess what I'm saying is be aware of those sheep dressed like...
But they seem like they don't chase the victim. Like in Bundy's case with this woman that, just walked away.
Yeah.
they don't seem to be aggressive until they capture them. Is that true?
Very, very good point. Absolutely. They pick their time to the second. And then, no, chasing is no good. Chasing causes police cognizance.
Mm-hmm.
Help me, please. He's chasing me. People stop. People turn. People look in the direction. That's the last thing they want. Serial killers are cowards, George. They do not want confrontation. Serial killers are all about getting the upper hand. They're punks. All of them are punks, just looking for that moment when their victim's guard is down. What I talked about before about Gacy drugging his victims, so did Jeffrey Dahmer, by the way. Same thing. He drugged them, George. He drugged them so they wouldn't fight back. They wouldn't scream. They wouldn't make a fuss. The police wouldn't be made aware that something's going on here. And they were successful. After Dahmer had 13 victims, one of them escaped. He ran, and the police actually brought him back, not knowing that the poor guy they were bringing him back to his death.
Oh, my God. You mean, that's right. The kid got away. The cops brought him back because I guess Jeffrey Dahmer was pretty calm about it, right?
Well, he was so convincing, and that's what makes these guys so scary, that they could look a cop in the eye and lie and pull it off. And there's a diabolicalness about that is rare, that we haven't seen, and we got to talk about it. We got to understand it.
What do you think their brains look like? Have their brains ever been looked at in an MRI or after they died in some cases, or while they were still living?
Well, you ask a good question, and the answer is this. Regarding their brains, yes, their brains have been studied while they were still alive, which is more important. The pathologies of their brains is normal after death, after autopsy.
Huh.
There's no like
physical problem,
giant tumor or some pressure in a part of the brain that causes aggression. What they do notice while they're doing MRIs of their brain is that they have more active. They have an abundance of serotonin, which is the chemical that makes us aggressive. They do have that, and there is something different about their brains than us. There has to be, because what they're doing is like almost like they're creatures from another planet, George. They, in the case of Bundy, I know a lot about this case, and I'll hark back to it only to give an example of the degree to which the depravity goes. Bundy was also a necromaniac. Bundy was, and this is an absolute fact, returning to bodies days old, week old, and having relations with them.
Oh, my God.
I know. And also, people don't know he was a cannibal, that he was biting genitalia from women and eating it, because they found missing parts of certain parts, which I won't go into now. I think your listeners are getting it. And they were bitten away by his teeth. If you remember, when he was ultimately arrested, he bit a couple of his victims. That's how they nailed them in Florida in the...
with the bite marks, right?
Exactly. He bit the woman's buttocks so hard that he left a permanent scar on in her flesh. They used that to nail him. They took a plaster cast of his bite. But that proves what I'm saying. I mean, what is he doing biting the woman? What he was doing was he was trying to take a chunk out of her, and for whatever reason he stopped midway. But he was actually a cannibal too. Yet here he is, this nice guy. Ann Rule wrote a book called The Stranger Beside Me. He worked in a suicide hotline next to Ann every night for months, and there he was on the talking people out of killing themselves. The nicest guy, the sweetest guy. He was a Republican. He was helping the governor, the Republican governor, get reelected. He was going to be a lawyer. He was a really nice, preppy guy. He was a monster.
Did he ever go after his friends? Did he have friends?
No, they're loners. They don't have friends.
They
Absolutely
don't have
not.
friends at all.
They're all loners. The pathology is they're loners. They're not gregarious. They take on the guise of the normal person next door, but that's like the quiet guy that never wants to be bothered with anyone, usually shy. Every single one of them fit that mold. No, they don't buddy up. They don't go to watch sports with friends. Their sport, George, is stalking and killing human beings.
As workers, what kinds of jobs do they hold, and in their workplace, are they loners as well?
For the most part, what they do is what they need to do to put food on the table and live a life. In other words, the crimes are not part and parcel of them being able to exist. They don't steal from their victims. Very, 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 very rarely do serial killers aspire to stealing from their victims and try to sustain themselves that way. They will look at what Jeffrey Dahmer was working in a candy store. John Wayne Gacy had a construction business. Ted Bundy did whatever work came his way. Richard Ramirez was an exception.
Let me hold on there. We're at the break. We'll come back, talk about Richard Ramirez, and also wealthy people. Have there ever been any wealthy serial killers? I'm George Norrie, along with Philip Carlo on Coast to Coast AM. Well, if you live in the greater St. Louis area, as I do once in a while, circle this Thursday, September 28th at 1:30. I'll be at the Barnes & Noble bookstore on Watson Road in Crestwood. Come on by to say hi. Appreciate it. Back in a moment. Back with you, Philip Carlo, our guest. We'll take phone calls with Philip next hour. Philip, you were talking about the Ramirez story, and also there's a song that's kind of tied into him, Night Prowler, AC/DC's version. What was the significance of that song?
Well, there was a song, that it was from the Highway to Hell album, and Richard was very motivated by heavy metal music. Its aggressive lyrics, the aggressive beat, was something that he was obsessed with. He felt the music spoke to him. He felt, too, that song had been written about him. If you listen to the lyrics, it's exactly what he did, prowling the night, looking into windows, entering windows, causing havoc. It was his favorite album. He just loved it. And if you think of the lyrics, it fit him like a T.
Let's play a little bit of it, can we?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Okay. But when we do, did he react to the song and then he carried things out, or how did it affect him?
He felt it was giving him license to do what he was doing. He felt that he was part of a subculture, another world of people that want to do those types of things, and he was just the man. He was the man, and he was doing what many people wanted to do but didn't have the balls to do.
Is he still alive, Philip?
Yeah, he's still alive. He's in San Quentin's death row. Guess what, George?
What?
I guarantee you he's listening right now, because they're allowed to listen to the radio. They all have radios on their cells on death row, and like I said before, they're up at night. And I know that your show is broadcast in Marin County, and I wouldn't doubt if he's listening. So, Richard, we're going to play Highway to Hell. You ready, man?
We're going to do that. Okay, let's listen and see how it affected Richard Ramirez. And there's a little intro that obviously comes into this before the lyrics start that affected Ramirez. Did you find him to be personable, Philip?
Very. Actually, I found him to be nice, congenial.
Nice? Really?
Yeah. How are you today? You know, how you feeling? Did you get a good night's sleep? How was your trip out? How was the plane ride? How's your hotel, Phil? Are you having good food out there? What are you reading now, Phil? When's your birthday, Phil? Oh, really? It's your birthday soon? And then I find he sent me a card when it was my birthday.
All right, well, here we go. Let's listen to the lyrics. This should be coming up any second. So you must have listened to this over and over and over again, huh, Philip?
Yes, and if you heard the lyrics just now, I don't know if you listeners benefit, but that's exactly what he did. The group later denied that they wrote it as inspired by what he was doing, but that's baloney. You listen to it, you know that they were writing it about what he was doing. I'm the night prowler, get out of my way. All they had to do is say, I'm the night stalker, get out of my way. I mean, it fit him like a T, and they didn't have the balls to later say that it was Richard that inspired them.
Listen to this from Brian in Park City, Kansas.
Yeah.
Dennis Rader was the first person I met when I moved here. He was smart, nice, told me the history of the town. Right. When he was arrested, he talked about who he had in mind next. It was my wife. It was me. That's kind of chilling.
And that's also part and parcel of what we were talking about before, about him seeming like such a nice guy, and he's got a smile on his face, but there's something going on in the back of his brain, and what's going on in the back of his brain is murder, most foul. And George, you need to realize, and your listeners need to realize, it's not just murder this guy was after. He was having sex with the victims as they were being tortured. In every crime scene, there was semen. There were multiple incidences. Actually, it wasn't just once. And it's like what we've been saying all night long. It's a sexual enterprise. It's rape taken to the extreme. That's exactly what
in every serial case, correct?
Absolutely, from Jack the Ripper on.
Now, these cases, Philip, though, of, and we hear about them every week. There's another missing girl somewhere.
Right.
Are they the victims of one of these 500 serial killers that you think are roaming the countryside?
Absolutely. It's not a matter of do I think it. That's exactly what happened. All these missing girls. How about these girls that are, you see, what's happening now, which is wonderful. Society is finally waking up and smelling the coffee. They're putting cameras where before there were no cameras. So suddenly we're actually seeing the abductions. We're seeing these monsters walk up to these teenage girls, walking along, thinking their thoughts, worried about coming home from late, worried about their job, worried about their boyfriend. Suddenly some guys in their face, hey, I'm a cop. Hey, you're coming with me. Having a knife in their hand, a gun in their hand, or a badge in their hand, and taking them to the vehicle, which is close by, and we never see that girl again. Had it not been for that camera pointed in that direction, in that parking lot that night, we would have never known what happened to that girl. And because we have it on film, we're finding out who these guys are, and they are the predicate felons. It's the people that go away for sex crimes, and what they learn in jail is not to get caught. And what they learn, the best way not to get caught, don't leave a victim, kill them.
And these people are not particularly strong or powerful, are they?
The victims?
No, the perpetrator, the serial killer.
I'll tell you, George, it's a very interesting question because it seems when they're in the killing mode, they are very strong. Something comes over. Let's call it adrenaline.
Is this like the guy who can lift up a car if his friend is trapped? Okay.
Exactly. That's exactly what it's about. Yeah, they actually do have superhuman strength. It's almost as though it's a combination of whatever insanities are going on in their brain fused with adrenaline, and it just makes them very, very strong. One of those guys gets you in their grip, you ain't getting away.
Yet do they have, all of them, specific profiles? I mean, what was Ramirez's profile, by the way? Did he have one? A specific person he wanted to go after?
Well, what the Night Stalker was after was this: entering homes in good neighborhoods, and whoever was ever in that home fell into his victim category. He stayed away from Hispanic areas. He was Hispanic. He didn't want to. He was after white people, basically, Anglo-Saxons. To some degree, his pathology was political. It was the us against them syndrome. Though, to answer your question, yes, the victim do fall in very specific categories. In Bundy's case, and I'll just keep using him as an example because he's so well known, it was pretty females with dark hair with a part in the center. In John Wayne Gacy, it was boys between 13 and 16 years old. All his victims fell into that time slot. Athletic, good-looking jock types. In Dahmer's case, it was also boys. He liked Asian boys, Hispanic boys. So yes, they do have very specific types that they go after, when they see that type, they focus in on it, and until they get access to it, they don't rest.
What happened in their life, Philip? What happened to them where they have this specific interest in a kind of person?
This is a very interesting question. In other words, you're asking what specifically makes that victim group manifest
stand out in this guy. Yeah.
Right. It's hard to say, George. It would be like Freudian armchair analyzing. In Bundy's case, they said it was a girl that looked like that rejected him. But I think it's baloney. It's just a type. I mean, it's really as simple as why George, are you drawn to a certain type of woman? Why do I like brunettes with big eyes? Why do I like a tall woman with small waist? It's just the way it is.
It's just the way it is.
And instead of going through the normal dating rituals that normal people go through, they cut to what they're into, and what they're into is abduction and sexual sadism. But it's as simple as matter as taste. That's just what their taste is.
One of his first victims was a 79-year-old woman, Ramirez's. And tell me if this is true. It's speculated that Ramirez was influenced to go on his killing spree by stories told to him by his cousin, who claimed to have been a Green Beret in Vietnam. The cousin boasted to the 10-year-old Ramirez at the time of torturing and mutilating Vietnamese women, showing him grisly photographs purportedly of his victims. Ramirez was also present when the cousin murdered his wife, and apparently his parents were highly religious, but his father, not shy of physical punishment, would scare the heck out of Ramirez so much he would spend nights in a cemetery. Is that true?
It's all from my book, where you just said nobody knew, nobody knew about him sleeping in the cemetery. I was the first person he told that to. Nobody knew that his cousin murdered his wife in front of him when he was 13. I was the first person he told that to.
You got that.
Yes, to answer your question,
it is true.
It's not. His cousin was a highly decorated Green Beret, a really bad guy, toughest guy in the neighborhood before he was drafted. He was like a very rare 1 in 100,000 type who loved war, who was an excellent soldier. In 2 cases, he was the only person that survived attacks in his platoon. He came back with a highly decorated medals all over his chest as a sergeant. He also came back with a shoebox filled with Polaroid photographs of VC women who he had abducted, taken into the forest, raped and murdered. He took families, whole families, in other words, mothers and 2 daughters or 3 daughters, and he raped them in front of one another and cut them up and took photographs of them terrified, naked, tied to a tree, and then took photographs of them headless and him holding the head up. When he came, and this is absolutely true, I got all this from Ramirez reluctantly. He didn't tell me like he was offering up an excuse. It was like one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. I kept badgering him, and ultimately he told me what I'm telling you now, and it is the absolute truth. And he was raping the woman. Now, he's telling this young boy these incidences, he's showing them these photographs, and it did have an effect on his psychic, a very, very profound effect, which ultimately was a bad effect. And I think if any one factor moved him in a direction, in the path, if you will, that he eventually walked, it was his cousin Mike. And his father was a policeman, by the way, and he believed in corporal punishment. Richard had 3 older brothers, and he beat the brothers a lot. And Richard was the youngest in the family, and he, as he got older, to get away from his father's wrath, he ran out of the house, and he took to sleeping in a nearby cemetery. And the John, a famous gunslinger, was buried in that cemetery. I forget his name, but it'll come to me.
Johnny Ringo. Who knows?
No, John Wesley Harding. And apparently he was sleeping near the tombstone of John Wesley Harding. And the family, his mother told me that they felt he was possessed by the devil, and they felt that perhaps his sleeping in the cemetery might have had something to do with that. And I know that you have listeners out there that are listening to this right now and thinking, oh, that's what it's about. Of course that's what it's about. And who's to say it's not? I certainly wouldn't. But that is all the truth. The name of the cemetery was La Loca, and I actually went there. I'm the type of writer that goes out in the world, George, as you know, and I go to the places. I spent weeks talking to his family, his teachers. I went into that cemetery at night, man, and let me tell you, it was spooky, very spooky. And interestingly, George, the first victim, Jenny Vincow, you just made reference to, she lived right across the street from a cemetery. And the incident happened on the night of a full moon. And I reenacted that crime. I went there on the night of a full moon. And it was so weird and so eerie because you had all these tombstones lined up, and you had the light of the moon on the tombstones, what looked like cake frosting, and it was absolutely macabre. And the whole experience of writing that book was very intense. But this thing with death and him and murder and cemeteries seemed to be all part of the same thing.
And the song, by the way, the song came out in '79. The one we just played. Ramirez didn't start his spree until '84, so he probably was influenced by the song, but I don't think the song was written about him.
I think you're right.
Couldn't have been. Well, we're going to take phone calls when we come back. And also when we come back, Philip, tell us what the signs are of these people. I mean, are there signs that people can try to remember? Maybe it'll help one person tonight. Is that possible?
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll do that. Our special guest tonight, Philip Carlo, his website, philipcarlo.com. And we're talking about his most current work called The Iceman, but he's written The Night Stalker, which was based on Richard Ramirez, Predators and Prayers, Stolen Flower as well. He has been doing this for many years now, and he's one of the top in his trade. If you need to email me, always simple, george@coasttocoastam.com, and I'll get right to you. And again, thanks to all of you in Detroit who came by to visit me during the book signing on Saturday, and we'll do it again on Sunday. We'll do it again on Thursday here in St. Louis. Sunday, I'll tell you about that later.